once again, thank you for joining us here today. Um, to start off, I understand that you have quite the background in the travel industry and truly have an intimate understanding of the needs of a traveler. Likewise, you're the creator of South Africa's newly launched Secura Traveler app and SATIB. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yes, SATIB, SATIB going.
SATIB. SATIB Insurance Brokers is also known to be a thought leader in the risk mitigation and management space. Can you please tell us a bit more about yourself?
Well, I think you've summed it up quite nicely. Thank you.
Yeah.
But yes, Jamie, I've been in tourism for about 30 years. Started off managing lodges and guiding in wilderness areas. I had a little pioneering tour operating company targeting the youth market in the mid-90s. So yeah, it was a really, really fun start. And then my wife and I traveled around the world for 5 years. So that was just exploring on our own and obviously being right in there with the entire travel space. And then coming back, the last 15 years or so, I've been involved in designing risk solutions for the tourism industry. So whether that's an insurance product, bespoke insurance product, or safety apps, like you mentioned previously, for me, it's very much about making sure that tourists can move around our country and the globe safely.
And that's quite exciting and quite the timeline is quite interesting. Everything you've been through and what you've done. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about travel insurance and why it's essential for travelers, especially those visiting African countries?
Well, firstly, I just think it's important that, we're all responsible for our own safety and financial security and whatnot. And there is a tendency to push those responsibilities to others or onto organizations. So I think first and foremost, it's important to realize that travelers must take care of themselves. And that's travel insurance. So travel insurance does two things really, if we can simplify it. The one is it provides financial protection to the traveler for sort of unexpected or unforeseen events, whether it's stolen items or cancellations or trip postponements or medical illness. And the other is that it provides access to an assistance company. Because obviously when you're traveling, you're away from home, you don't have your immediate and trusted network. So that assistance company is critical. It's your lifeline, and they're your support line. So those are the two main things. It's your financial protection, and anything can really happen in that space while you're traveling. Trip cancellation, postponement, interruption, delayed flights, missed connections, overbooked flights, lost luggage. There's a myriad of things that can happen. And yes, people do get sick while they travel. They might have an accident. There might be a need for security protection, which is a more increasingly required cover. So all of those things are important to travelers while they move, not only in Africa, but around the world.
Yeah, and that's why not all travel insurance policies are created equal, from my understanding and from what you've just conveyed.
Correct. I think, I suppose it's the same as if you had a medical condition. Do you take something generic off the shelf, visit a GP, or do you have a specialist or specific need? And I think specifically for those traveling to Africa, you're not traveling to a major city in Europe or the States or Australia or wherever it might be. We've got wonderful developed cities, but people travel here to get to our remote wilderness areas and to outlying spaces and into our beautiful, unique vastness. So immediately they're putting themselves into a space that is unique and it is different. So you need to have a product that is bespoke for travel to Africa. And many don't realize that. So the average travel policy out there is fantastic. It's going to look after your needs if you're going to Europe and America, like I say, but travel's got its very own unique challenges and unique risks.
Yeah. Are there any particular safety and security challenges that travelers should be aware of when exploring Africa, and how can the travel insurance help mitigate these risks?
So yeah, I think some of them are generic to other countries, but travel insurance to Africa, certainly what comes to mind is, and just, comparing policies that we've created that are bespoke to African travel versus those that are just internationally available, and serve that purpose. Immediately, what is important is to make sure that it's linked with an assistance company that knows Africa. So a call center sitting in Europe or in Sri Lanka or in the States doesn't have an intimate knowledge of the geography, the facilities, the resources, the infrastructure, just all the little nuances that are apparent when you visit a country like Africa. So that assistance company becomes very important. Medical cover is very often not adequate to get you home from an airstrip in Europe back to an airstrip in the States, or from developed country to developed country, is not as expensive as it is to try and evacuate you out of Africa. We're a long haul destination, which means it's an awful long way from often from the traveler's home country, yeah, it's expensive. So that's the medical cover. Often the limits aren't high enough, and that's referring specifically to the evacuation and repatriation, which is key. People generally, if they get sick, they want to go home.
Yeah.
There's an increased exposure to possible trip cancellation, interruption, delays, missed connections. The need for a policy that covers adventure activities, outdoor activities, game drives, walks, bungee jumping, white river rafting, all of the fun stuff that people do when they come to Africa, that's sometimes excluded, or just capped in terms of what they're prepared to pay if something had to happen in that space. Political unrest, civil unrest. We understand the travel challenges we have in South Africa, but it's no different, to be quite honest, than many countries around Africa. There's sort of a bit of political instability, if I can call it that, as you would find with strikes and riots happening in maybe Ecuador or Mexico, or dare I say France. So those, we do tend to have them a little bit more frequently here. So security protection, or access to security devices, is key, and that's a new inclusion into a lot of policies. And then people need to look out for the duration and flexibility of their policy. Are they covering it from the time they leave home to the time they arrive home, including their transit travel? That's key, not just from the time you arrive in Africa. And then the cost. I think there is some exorbitant costs out there when it comes to travel insurance. People just aren't in the know. And equally dangerous, I suppose, is the very cheap insurance that gets bundled onto a credit card purchase, or whatever the case might be. And it really doesn't cover the needs for travel to Africa.
Yeah. That's all very interesting, and it is something that people should consider when traveling to Africa. The political unrest, the what type of travel insurance you can get for like your adventure enthusiasts, and all that. Yeah. And I'm sure it also covers what we had previously spoken about with what's happening in Africa. Natural disasters that are,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're quite right. Sorry, I didn't touch on that, but you're quite right. I mean, we've had our fair share of those here in South Africa with some flooding, other parts of the world, and wildfires that do, cause damage. And
Yeah.
interrupt journeys. So yeah, absolutely. Natural disasters is an inclusion in some, but not all policies. So exactly, people should look out for that as well. It's not uncommon to have trips or parts of your journey interrupted by a natural disaster. So you want to be able to evacuate out of that space and continue your journey in another spot.
Yeah. Um, in your experience, what are some common misconceptions or challenges travelers face when making claims on their travel insurance policies, particularly when they encounter safety or security issues during their travels?
Yeah, that's a very good question because, I think the first obvious point here is that, and I think we're all guilty of this, is that we don't read our policies. So, that immediately brings in misunderstanding. So I think first and foremost, I would encourage anybody who is traveling and has been issued with a travel benefits or policy wording to read through it carefully. I think there's an onus on insurers to now make sure that the insurance speak is taken out of those top policy wordings, and it's a lot more understandable. So read them. It's important. And I think that would do away with a lot of the misconceptions. But more to your point, I think when people do claim, they are not necessarily equipped with the right claims material. So that you do need to have your police reports. You need to have invoices for the items that you purchased to replace what that was lost. So all of those documentations and receipts need to be a part of your claim submission. That's quite key. If there are any airlines that have cancelled, we need to have a record of those disputes with the airlines and all the safari operators, so that we can, again, formulate a claim. There's just unfortunately so much fraud in the claims environment, in insurance across the board and globally, that insurers are absolutely adamant that you need proper record in order to formulate your claim. So that's the one thing that people must do. They mustn't just assume they can collect a claim without any proof of their loss. So they need to prove their loss. Insurance for those who are over 80, unfortunately, is very difficult to come by. So don't assume that you've just received a policy and you're over 80, you've received a policy. Just read through the fine print, because there's probably going to be a repudiation of your claim if you are over that age. Another myth is that swiping your credit card gives you appropriate cover. Not necessarily true if you're traveling to Africa, just purely because of you will get insurance, but it won't necessarily be appropriate insurance. And then the misconception, I think there's misconception is that if people buy insurance, everything is covered. But certainly things like security protection is not an automatic inclusion in your policies. If you want to cancel because of an event that's happened at home, or you need to just adjust or change, you need to cancel because you've got another event that's come up, or because your dog's ill at home, or because your friend is perhaps sadly passed away. Those aren't necessarily automatic triggers. You need to buy up to a cancellation for any reason. There's normally only about 8 or 10 actual triggers that will allow you to claim legitimately against the travel policy. So it's quite easy to understand.
Can you elaborate on what those 8 triggers are?
I mean, there are, just off the top of my head, and you don't quote me on this, but I mean, your common ones would be if a close relative or traveling companion dies, is ill, or yourself, obviously, fall ill, or has a serious sickness, then that would trigger. If there's a major catastrophe at home, maybe your house burns down, something along those lines, then that would be cause for a trigger. If you have a traumatic event at home, it could be a rape or a hijacking or a situation like that. A traumatic event is a quite a broad term, but it's quite specifically described in policy wording these days. Because what's a trauma to me and what's a trauma to you, Jamie, could be two different things.
Yeah.
If there's a retrenchment, that's or a relocation around your work, that's often included as well. So it's elements like that that would come into play. If there's a natural disaster occurring, or a political action or terrorist attack within 20 kilometers of you or your traveling country, that's also included. So those are your typical defined triggers that would occur.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just quickly going to plug something in here. Sorry, apparently the battery wasn't charging for whatever reason.
Okay.
But thank you for elaborating on the various triggers that some people may or may not have known. I wanted to ask, based off of what you had been speaking about, what advice would you give to anybody planning a trip to Africa in terms of selecting the right insurance, staying informed about safety and security, and making the most of their coverage?
Well, firstly, it would be get insurance. I think a lot of people think they can rely on medical aid or absorb any potential financial loss. But the reality is that trips to Africa are expensive. Once you're here, it's a fairly cost-effective country or continent to visit, but getting here is quite pricey. So, and if something had to go wrong in Africa, like we've mentioned a couple of times before, getting home is exorbitant. It's very expensive and financially crippling. So get insurance. Don't fool yourself, just get insurance. Then obviously make sure that you've got a product that is relevant for travel to Africa. Because if you're going to spend the money, you might as well be buying the right thing. Pay attention to that assistance provider. Make sure that they have capabilities and capacity and an intimate understanding of the geography and the infrastructure around Africa, so they can actually help you when the pawpaw hits the fan. And make sure you plan your trip, and this is not insurance related necessarily, but make sure you plan your trip with African specialists. Destination management companies and tour operators that know and deal with travel in Africa, because they'll make sure that you've got the right itinerary supported by reputable lodges, hotels, transfer companies, etc. And all of that goes a long way to adding to the safety of your journey at the end of the day.
No, I definitely agree. And it's important to make the most of your journey by planning ahead, which goes back into what you mentioned at the beginning of our interview, where travelers need to take responsibility for themselves first before they go ahead and take that plunge into
Exactly
the trip.
that. Exactly
Yeah.
that.
So previously in our previous discussion, you had mentioned that SATIB does have relationships across Africa with different parties. Can you delve into that a bit more?
From an insurance perspective, or the travel insurance perspective, yes. So the fact that we've been in the tourism space for 30 years, or 30 years plus. So over that time, you've developed a lot of relationships across the continent, and specifically in the tourism hubs, South African, the SADC countries, Southern Africa, East Africa, Indian Ocean Islands, obviously major areas for tourism. So we have we've got 2,000 odd companies across Africa with their lodges, hotels, overlanders, etc., that we insure. And so that's on the one side. So the network is there. But more importantly, from an assistance perspective, we are not limited to a Netcare 911, an ER24, an ISOS. Our team can access any resource, virtually any resource, with aircraft, helicopters, ambulances across the continent, because of the way we've set up our systems, provide our assistance services. And equally, we can often access resources that are private in that space. So we might have a neighbor who we know has got a good and a solid first aid response kit and first aid team that can get across and help stabilize the situation, because we can't get an aircraft in there for 8 hours until it becomes light, perhaps, and that these are all sort of nuances or situations that occur that are unexpected. So we do have the capabilities, capacities, relationships, and extended network that is unparalleled across Africa to ensure safe response and assistance in the event of an incident.
Okay. No, I think that is incredibly important. Those are things that we should consider when looking into our insurance, and it's great that you have such an extensive network. Yeah. To wrap up, could you share any additional resources or websites so that travelers can find out more information about insurance for African adventures, and any emerging trends or developments that we should be aware of from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I'll touch on the emerging trends first, and this is, again, it's just my opinion. But I think you will find that, travelers are looking to agents, tour operating companies, because they are trusted specialists in that space. And we're certainly seeing a trend for people to want to, they rely on that, they trust that, there's that relationship. So the more operators can bundle into their packages, the better. We're seeing them putting together, obviously, lodges, transfers, etc., and insurance. So now tour operators are embedding deposit guarantees. They're embedding travel insurance. They're embedding financial protection into their travel policies, because travelers are expecting some element of financial protection, of safety and security, because there's a duty of care. If I'm planning a trip for you to my destination, you have that duty of care. So certainly a trend in terms of plugging in those financial guarantees and those medical assistance services. There's a trend for people to be looking for cancellation for any reason cover, which is much, much broader than those defined triggers we spoke about earlier, because that would offer you, as it would suggest, much, much broader financial protection at the end of the day. So that's in terms of trends, I would think. And then I think just in terms of places where people can go, obviously the SATIB website. So it's www.satib for bravo.co.za, satib.co.za. And then, SATSA is the South African Tourism Services Association, and they are responsible for, I would say, probably 70% of the inbound traffic to Africa, certainly in the Southern African region. So they're a wealth of knowledge and resource, and that can be found on www.satsa.com. So those are the two major websites. Obviously, getting hold of me directly is quite possible and doable, and you're welcome to share. My email address is andre@satib.co.za, and I'll leave it at that. That's plenty.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Andre. We really appreciate your time and expertise on the subject.